At 9:31 local time, the Sea of Japan is doing what it does on overcast October mornings, producing a gray, flat, featureless expanse of cold water that extends to a horizon that looks like it was drawn by someone who ran out of ideas at the waterline. The surface temperature is 14 degrees Celsius. There is a low swell from the northwest. Visibility is 9 nautical miles, which is adequate for everything that matters and sufficient for nothing that is about to happen to matter in the way the other party intends. USS Mustin, hull number DDG-89, an Arleigh Burke-class guided missile destroyer assigned to the 7th Fleet, is making 16 knots on a standard patrol track in international waters approximately 80 nautical miles southwest of the Korean peninsula. It has been here or in waters very like this for 6 weeks. The watch section is alert in the way of people who have been at sea long enough that alertness has become indistinguishable from their resting state. On the bridge, the officer of the deck is managing a tactical picture that includes a Japanese maritime self-defense force destroyer 11 nautical miles to the southeast, a regular presence on this patrol track, a coordination relationship that is professional and unhurried and characterized by the comfortable operational shorthand of allies who have worked together long enough to need very few words. 2 commercial vessels to the north, both tracked, both routine. A fishing fleet to the west that has been in the same general area for 3 days and shows no signs of operational ambition. And at 9:31, a contact. Bearing 315, fast, airborne. 2 contacts, close interval, departing the North Korean coast at a heading that resolves within approximately 90 seconds of track establishment as inbound. The tactical action officer logged it. He had seen North Korean aircraft contacts before. Every officer who has served in the 7th Fleet has seen North Korean aircraft contacts before. The contacts appear on the northern radar returns with a frequency that suggests less deliberate operational planning than reflexive institutional response. America is here, therefore we respond, therefore we scramble, therefore we discovered the same things we discovered the last time we scrambled, which is that the airspace between Pyongyang's air doctrine and physical reality contains a gap approximately as wide as the Korean peninsula itself. At Sunchon Air Base, approximately 35 miles north of Pyongyang, 2 MiG-29 Fulcrum fighters had lifted off at 0924. The MiG-29 is, in its original Soviet design, a genuinely capable aircraft. It was designed in the late 1970s as a direct counter to the F-15 and F-16. And in its time, it was a serious platform. Fast, maneuverable, equipped with a capable radar and a weapons load that Western analysts spent considerable effort evaluating with appropriate seriousness. Russia exported it to roughly 24 countries. Some of those countries have maintained, upgraded, and modernized their fleets. North Korea is not among them. North Korea received its MiG-29s in the late 1980s from the Soviet Union and has been attempting, with the specific ingenuity of a nation operating under comprehensive international sanctions, to keep them operational ever since. The result is an aircraft that, in its current configuration, represents something that aerospace engineers would describe as a maintenance challenge, and operational planners would describe, in the specific vocabulary of someone who has reviewed the assessed flight hour data, as a machine whose relationship with gravity is more negotiable than the design specification intended. The North Korean MiG-29 fleet flies approximately 15 to 25 hours per pilot per year. To calibrate this number, a U.S. Navy F/A-18 pilot accumulates between 200 and 250 hours per year. A student pilot in a civilian flight school typically logs more hours in their first 8 weeks of training than a North Korean MiG-29 pilot accumulates in a year of operational flying. The radar on the aircraft, the RLPK-29 Pulse Doppler Fire Control System, was state-of-the-art in 1983, which was the year Return of the Jedi was in theaters, and the Soviet defense industry was at the peak of its operational relevance. It has not been substantially updated since. The IFF system, the identification friend or foe transponder used to distinguish allied from non-allied contacts, uses interrogation codes from the Soviet-era architecture, which means it communicates, in the specific frequency and protocol sense, with approximately nothing currently operational in any other air force on the planet. It operates in a sovereign electronic ecosystem of one. Both pilots had been briefed on their mission at 9:10. The target was an American surface combatant operating in the waters that the Democratic People's Republic of Korea regards, in the language of its official maritime doctrine, as lying within the operational sphere of the Korean People's Army Navy, which is a legal position that the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, the relevant international legal instrument, does not support, but which the DPRK has maintained with the specific confidence of a nation that has decided what the law should say and is waiting for the law to catch up. The mission: intercept, demonstrate presence, generate imagery, return. A statement? The kind of statement North Korea makes regularly, in the same way that some people knock on a door they have knocked on before. Not because they expect it to open differently, but because not knocking would itself be a statement. And the statement they wish to make requires the knock. The lead pilot had approximately 340 total flight hours. This sounds like a meaningful number until you consider that it represents roughly 18 months of flying for a U.S. Navy pilot, distributed across a career that, in North Korean military aviation, spans considerably more years than that. He was, by his service's standards, experienced. His aircraft had been inspected the previous week. The inspection had identified 3 maintenance items. 1 had been addressed. The other 2 had been documented and categorized in the way that maintenance items get categorized when replacement parts require import through sanctions channels, which is to say, they had been given status codes that translate approximately as noted, pending, and not expected to be resolved before the next inspection. One of the 2 outstanding items was the radar. Specifically, the RLPK-29's range gate was intermittently unstable, producing target returns at approximately 70% of nominal accuracy. In practical terms, this meant the radar could see USS Mustin, but was uncertain across a margin of several nautical miles about exactly where it was seeing it. This is not ideal for an intercept mission. It is approximately the navigational equivalent of being told your destination is in the eastern part of a city, but not which street. Now, the vulnerability that nobody aboard USS Mustin had planned for, and that the North Korean mission planners had not planned for either, because it was not in their intelligence picture, which was based on imagery and assessments that had a lag time longer than the maintenance event itself. At 9:19, 5 minutes before the MiG-29s lifted off and 12 minutes before the contacts appeared on USS Mustin's scope, the ship's SH-60 Seahawk helicopter had been repositioned to the flight deck in SAR standby configuration. A U.S. Navy vessel operating within potential response distance of the Korean Peninsula maintains a standing search and rescue readiness posture as a matter of standard operating procedure, and the SAR standby configuration places the helicopter at 5-minute launch readiness on the deck with rotors folded, crew briefed, and deck crew in position. The configuration requires the aft section of the flight deck to be staffed with personnel who are in the engagement arc of the aft CIWS mount, the close-in weapon system on USS Mustin's stern, creating the same arc restriction that had applied in the Red Sea during the Shahed 136 engagement, for the same safety reasons, with the same operational implication. The aft CIWS sector was restricted for the duration of the SAR standby period. The SAR standby posture was maintained for 25 minutes as standard protocol before being stood down if no tasking materialized. It had been initiated at 9:19. The MiG-29s were inbound from 0924. The aft CIWS arc restriction would lift at 0944. The aircraft were estimated at closest point of approach at 0951, but the engagement threshold, if one were reached, was potentially earlier. 12 minutes of arc restriction, 2 MiG-29s at Mach 1.06 on a direct inbound bearing. The coincidence again was real. The North Korean mission planners had not chosen this window deliberately, but they had chosen it in the specific sense that the universe sometimes produces accidental geometry, and the geometry was what it was. The commanding officer was in CIC at 9:33. He looked at the tracks. He looked at the SAR standby status. He looked at the estimated closure profile. He said two things. First, what is the JMSDF destroyer's track? Because the Japanese maritime self-defense force vessel, 11 miles southeast, was a coordination resource with its own capabilities and its own engagement authority. And in a coalition operating environment, the geometry of the response is not limited to a single hull. Second, how long on SAR standby? The answer was 11 minutes remaining. He nodded once. He pulled up a chair. 11 minutes. 2 MiG-29s inbound. The AN/SPY-1D was tracking both contacts with the mechanical accuracy of a system that processes multiple inbound tracks the way an airport control tower processes landing cues. Methodically, without finding any individual entry particularly interesting, and with absolute confidence in the sequencing. 17 engagement solutions had been built and ranked before the aircraft crossed the 60 nautical mile mark. 17. The lead pilot's radar was struggling to resolve USS Mustin's precise position within a margin of several nautical miles. The SPY-1D had his precise position within meters. There is a specific asymmetry in this encounter that deserves a moment of honest reflection before the humor takes over, because it is the kind of asymmetry that is simultaneously funny and quietly staggering. The lead pilot is flying an aircraft in active maintenance discrepancy with a radar operating at 70% nominal accuracy at approximately 15 knots per hour, less than the aircraft's rated maximum speed. Because operating a MiG-29 with outstanding maintenance items at full military power is a decision that requires more confidence in the airframe than the inspection record supports, toward a ship that has been tracking him since 6 nautical miles inside his own radar's maximum range. He is attempting to find the ship. The ship found him before he crossed into South Korean airspace. It is not like bringing a knife to a gunfight. It is more like bringing a map with several pages missing to a navigation competition in which the other participant has GPS, 3 redundant backups, and a dedicated satellite overhead. At 0938, the RLPK-29 aboard the lead aircraft acquired a surface contact. The pilot called it on the tactical frequency. He had a bearing and a rough range. He had the wrong rough range. The range gate instability had placed USS Mustin approximately 4 nautical miles closer to the aircraft's position than the ship actually was, which produced an intercept geometry that the pilot was flying toward with appropriate commitment, and that would, when he reached the expected visual acquisition point, produce nothing but open water. USS Mustin would be 4 nautical miles further south than his radar told him, and he would arrive at his intercept point to find the Sea of Japan performing its standard impression of a large body of water containing no American destroyer. The SLQ-32 electronic warfare suite had been collecting against the RLPK-29's emissions since 0934. The pulse Doppler's signature was in the threat library under an entry that had been written in 1989, reviewed twice in the 1990s, and flagged as low probability of encounter, retain for completeness at some point during the following decade. The flag had now been removed, as flags of this type tend to be when the low probability event materializes inbound at Mach 1.06. The emission profile was clean, strong, and because the RLPK-29 was operating at reduced accuracy, slightly irregular in its pulse timing, a characteristic that the SLQ-32 noted, logged, and added to the collection record as a probable indicator of the range gate instability condition. The ship knew the aircraft's radar was degraded before the pilot knew his intercept geometry was wrong. He's going to arrive at his intercept point and find nothing, the electronic warfare officer said, watching the collection feed. How long until he figures that out? The tactical action officer asked. At his current closure rate, approximately 6 minutes after he crosses his expected CPA. A pause, at which point he will have been airborne for about 40 minutes. What's the MiG-29's typical fuel endurance? Published figure is approximately 30 minutes of combat maneuvering, 45 minutes at cruise in standard configuration. With their maintenance profile, our assessment is you subtract 10 to 15% from any published figure as a starting estimate. The tactical action officer did not respond to this immediately. He was doing the math that the electronic warfare officer had already done. A pilot with approximately 35 to 40 minutes of usable fuel airborne at 0924 would reach a fuel state requiring return to base at approximately 0959. At the rate the intercept geometry was developing, the pilot would arrive at his expected visual acquisition point at approximately 0951, find no destroyer, spend approximately 2 to 4 minutes attempting to reacquire using a radar with a 4 nautical mile range gate error, and begin his recovery at approximately 0953 to 0955. The fuel math and the navigation math were converging on the same conclusion from different directions. This intercept was going to end not with an engagement or a confrontation, but with a pilot turning north toward Sunchon with a fuel state that did not encourage leisurely departure routing. At 9:43, 1 minute before the SAR standby arc restriction lifted, USS Mustin's commanding officer looked at the tracks one final time. The lead MiG-29 was at 31 nautical miles and tracking toward a point in the water approximately 4 miles north of the ship's actual position. The secondary aircraft was maintaining formation at close interval. The commanding officer stood up, set down his coffee, which had been acceptable throughout because in the Sea of Japan in October, the ambient temperature makes a covered thermos a viable option, and said, "Maintain course and speed. Log the interaction. Let me know when he figures out he's in the wrong place." Then he went back to his chair. He had a report to finish. At 9:44, the SAR standby arc restriction lifted. The aft CIWS resumed full engagement arc coverage. The vulnerability window closed with approximately 7 minutes to spare before the aircraft reached its closest point of approach, which was itself not the ship's actual position. At 9:51, the lead pilot arrived at his expected intercept point. His radar showed open water. He transmitted on the tactical frequency. The transmission was on an unencrypted channel, not because North Korean military communications doctrine recommends unencrypted tactical transmissions, but because the frequency allocation and encryption architecture of a MiG-29 maintained on a sanctions-constrained budget in 2024 reflects the communications infrastructure that was available when the aircraft was procured, which is the communications infrastructure of 1988. The SLQ-32 was recording. The Intercept team was listening. The transmission said, "In the specific tonal register of a pilot who has arrived at a predetermined location and found it contains nothing he was sent to find." Approximately what you would expect it to say. The content was not strategic intelligence, but the voice pattern, the frequency, the encryption, absent where expected, all of it logged, all of it in the collection record. The secondary aircraft, which had maintained formation throughout, transmitted a reply. Then a longer exchange followed, running approximately 90 seconds, during which the two pilots communicated about their fuel state, their radar picture, and their assessment of the situation. The SLQ-32 recorded all of it. The Intercept team noted that the exchange used standard military brevity codes layered over what was effectively clear voice communication. The brevity codes provided the format of encrypted tactical communication without the function, in the way that a combination lock with the combination written on the back provides the appearance of security without its substance. They're doing their RTB fuel calculation on an open channel, the electronic warfare officer said. "How are they looking?" the executive officer asked. "Tied, ma'am. If the assessment is right about the fuel margin, the lead aircraft has approximately 6 minutes of comfortable flying left before the return gets interesting." He paused. He's going to have a story for his ready room. The ready room story would be, by the standards of ready room stories, technically truthful and operationally incomplete. The pilot had flown an intercept of an American destroyer. He had been in the general area. He had not been in the specific area because his radar had placed him 4 nautical miles north of where the ship actually was, but this is a detail that the ready room story could accommodate in various ways, most of them involving the discretion available to the narrator of any story where the instrumentation and the outcome can be reconciled without requiring the audience to know which one was wrong. At 9:53, both aircraft turned north. Fuel state, presumably, had rendered the geometry non-negotiable. USS Mustin maintained course and speed. The officer of the deck logged the departure time of both contacts. The JMSDF destroyer to the southeast, which had been tracking the same contacts on its own sensor picture throughout the engagement period and had its own communications directly with USS Mustin's command structure, logged a parallel record. Between the two ships, the interaction had been observed, documented, and cross-correlated from 2 independent sensor platforms simultaneously, a level of coverage that the North Korean mission planners had not factored into their assessment because the presence of the JMSDF destroyer had apparently not been in their picture. The intelligence package from the interaction was smaller than the packages from the Gulf or the Red Sea, because a MiG-29 at 60 nautical miles on an intercept that doesn't complete provides less collection opportunity than a drone at close range or a helicopter making 4 passes. But what it provided was specific. The RLPK-29 emissions profile with range gate instability indicators, the unencrypted tactical net recording, the RTB fuel calculation exchange, and the precise track data that documented with the SPY-1D's meter-level accuracy the 4 nautical mile range gate error that had sent the pilot to the wrong position. That last item is not a signal intelligence product. It is a navigation intelligence product, and it tells the next watch section and the next commanding officer and the next pilot who faces a North Korean intercept exactly how much uncertainty to assign to the RLPK-29's range output in current operational condition. What do we assess caused the 4-mile error? The commanding officer asked during the after-action brief. Range gate instability in the RLPK-29, sir. We saw it in the emission timing. The pulse interval was irregular in the specific pattern associated with range gate processing issues. Our assessment is a hardware degradation rather than a calibration problem. So his radar told him we were 4 miles north of where we actually were. Yes, sir. He flew the intercept his radar gave him. The radar gave him the wrong intercept. 3 seconds of silence. Log it, forward it, and make sure the JMSDF gets a copy. He stood up. He had 6 pages of command chronology to write, a coordination message to the JMSDF destroyer to draft, and a recognition recommendation for the SAR standby crew who had maintained their posture with full professionalism throughout a period when the tactical picture was developing on the other side of the ship, unaware that their positioning was, for 11 minutes, the most operationally relevant detail on the watch section's status board. The recommendation would cite professional readiness. It would not cite the 11 minutes. But the people who read such recommendations in this fleet understand that professional readiness is never about the calm moments. Here is the accounting that the Sunchon mission debrief would not include. The lead pilot had flown an intercept that, from his perspective, demonstrated operational presence in the waters near the Korean peninsula and had logged flight hours that, in a program running 15 to 25 hours per year per pilot, were operationally significant. The aircraft had returned safely. The mission had been conducted and completed. In the terms of the institution that sent it, this was a successful sortie. From the collection perspective, the RLPK-29 range gate instability indicator was now in the threat library, distributed to every U.S. and Allied platform in the theater, carrying the current update. The unencrypted tactical net frequency was confirmed current and logged against the identified aircraft registration. The RTB fuel calculation exchange had provided a real-world fuel endurance data point that updated the assessment's 15% reduction factor to a more specific figure. And the 4 nautical mile range gate error had been documented with track data precise enough to be used as a targeting reference in the opposite direction. The next time a North Korean aircraft approached on an intercept, the watch team would know, before the pilot arrived, that his radar was telling him he was 4 miles north of where the engagement geometry actually was. The pilot had flown his intercept. The SPY-1D had been tracking him since before he knew where to look. By afternoon, Korean Central News Agency had reported on military exercises demonstrating the combat readiness of the Korean People's Army Air Force, accompanied by imagery from a different day's operations and narration that described the revolutionary spirit of the pilots. The language was vivid. The production was competent. A spokesperson confirmed the exercises had achieved their objectives. The report did not include the phrase range gate instability. It did not include the phrase open channel RTB calculation. It did not include the phrase 4 nautical miles north of the actual position. These are the kinds of operational details that do not improve a story told for a domestic audience, and the Korean Central News Agency has been optimizing for that audience for 70 years with considerable consistency of approach. USS Mustin's deck log for the period read, 9:31 to 9:58, 2 air contacts assessed, KPAF MiG-29, inbound bearing 315, no hostile action, no weapons employment, contacts turned north 953, SAR standby lifted 0944, full propulsion throughout, no damage, no personnel losses. The incident report was 6 pages. It was transmitted to 7th Fleet, copied to the JMSDF coordination channel, and flagged for the Pacific Fleet Threat Library update cycle. The JMSDF destroyer to the southeast sent a brief coordination message at 10:04. It contained, in the compact professional language of Allied naval communications, a track correlation confirming the 4 nautical mile range gate error from an independent sensor. It also contained, appended as a final line, a single observation in Japanese that the liaison officer translated for the watch section as, "Their radar appears to have given them incorrect information. We recommend noting this." The watch section recommended noting it. It was noted. It was forwarded. It is now in the specific way that all such notes eventually arrive at their destination, in a threat library entry that will be on the next ship that sails through these waters, loaded and current, waiting for the next contact, bearing 315. The officer of the deck finished her watch at 12 o'clock. The coffee in the thermos had lasted until 11:30, which is a better result than most thermos-based deployment strategies produce. She passed the deck, wrote her log entry, and went below. The Sea of Japan was still gray. The horizon was still unambitious. The next watch section came on and found the tactical picture routine. 2 commercial contacts to the north, the JMS-DF destroyer, to the southeast, a fishing fleet to the west. Nothing on bearing 315. The range gate error that nobody in Sunchon knew about was already in the Pacific Fleet distribution. The next pilot who lifts off on a bearing toward international waters would not know that either. But someone watching his track would. That is how this works. That is always how this works. Bye for now.